The loan that saved the American Revolution was not negotiated in Philadelphia, and it was not made by a government that officially recognized the entity it was financing. It was structured across Amsterdam and Paris, through commercial vehicles whose real function was never disclosed in the documents they produced, by men whose names appear in the financial record in capacities that do not correspond to the roles they were actually performing. The money moved. The war continued because it did. And the terms on which that money was extended bound the new American Republic to obligations it spent the next 3 decades struggling to honor, through institutional mechanisms, a national bank, a funded federal debt, a constitutional taxing power, that would not have been necessary in the form they eventually took if the revolution had been financed differently. The standard account of how the Continental Congress kept its armies in the field treats the financial history as background noise behind the military and political story. The financial record suggests the relationship runs the other way. The institutions that define the American Republic to this day were shaped, in material ways, by the terms that were set in Paris in 1776, in Amsterdam in 1777, and in the account books of a fictitious trading company whose founder spent the last 20 years of his life trying to collect what he was owed. That account was never fully settled. The question the historical record does not often ask directly is why. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Continental Congress that convened in Philadelphia in the autumn of 1775 held, in legal terms, almost no financial authority. It could not levy taxes on the citizens of the individual colonies that had sent its members. It could not compel state governments to contribute to a common treasury on any fixed schedule or in any guaranteed amount. It could not pledge the revenues of a sovereign state as security for external borrowing, because the state whose revenues it might have pledged did not yet exist in any form that European creditors would recognize as legally binding or enforceable. What it could do was print paper, and it exercised that authority at a pace that established almost immediately the pattern the currency would follow for the remainder of the decade. Between 1775 and 1779, the Congress authorized the emission of approximately $241 million in Continental notes. These instruments were backed by the collective good faith of 13 colonial legislatures that had not yet agreed on the terms of their own association with each other, let alone on a mechanism for redeeming the instruments they had jointly authorized. By 1780, a continental dollar purchased less than 2 cents in silver. The currency had not merely depreciated in the way that wartime inflation normally erodes purchasing power. It had demonstrated, publicly and unmistakably, to every creditor and investor in the Atlantic world, that the Congress lacked the institutional capacity to honor the financial commitments it made in its own name. The phrase that entered common speech, "not worth a continental," was not a rhetorical flourish used by political opponents to score points against the government. It was a market verdict, rendered daily in every commercial transaction conducted east of the Alleghenies by merchants and farmers and soldiers who had accepted the notes and watched them lose their value in their hands. Into this environment came the first covert financial channel, and it arrived before the Declaration of Independence had been signed, before a formal American government existed to receive it, and through an arrangement whose terms were constructed so that the question of what those terms actually were would remain unresolved for 6 decades. In May of 1776, the French Foreign Minister Vergennes authorized a secret transfer of 1 million livres tournois to the American cause. The Spanish government, approached through separate diplomatic channels and persuaded by similar strategic calculations, contributed an additional 1 million. The combined 2 million livres were routed through a commercial vehicle created specifically for the purpose, a fictitious trading company called Rodrigue, Hortalez et Compagnie, given a Paris address, a set of commercial account books, and the outward appearance of a private merchant enterprise engaged in the transatlantic arms trade. The man selected to manage this operation was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, a figure whose biography presents an almost implausible concentration of roles. He was the author of the plays that would provide the libretti for 2 of the most performed operas in the repertoire. He had served as a royal courier and intelligence operative through the reign of Louis XV. He was a trained watchmaker who had invented a mechanism that improved the precision of portable timepieces, and whose subsequent litigation over the rights to that invention had given him an education in the gap between what commercial agreements said and what they could be made to mean by a sufficiently determined party in a subsequent dispute. He was, in short, a man with exactly the combination of skills the French ministry needed for an operation that required commercial credibility, operational secrecy, and the specific intellectual capacity to structure a transaction that could be read differently by different parties, depending on what each party needed the transaction to mean. Beaumarchais had been arguing since early 1776 that French support for the American rebellion should take a commercial rather than a diplomatic form. An open military alliance with the Continental Congress risked immediate war with Britain, a war that France was not yet prepared to fight, had not yet decided to seek, and did not wish to announce through actions that would remove the ambiguity France needed to preserve its room for maneuver. A private trading company, ostensibly conducting ordinary Atlantic commerce in arms, clothing, powder, and equipment, could supply the Continental Army with the materiel it could not manufacture domestically and could not purchase openly in any European market, all while the French government maintained the formal posture of a neutral power observing a colonial rebellion it had not authorized, encouraged, or supplied. The deniability was the point. Beaumarchais provided it, and Vergennes valued it enough to authorize 2 million livres in government capital to make the operation possible. The goods that Hortalez et Compagnie delivered to American ports between 1776 and 1778 were substantial in quantity and current in quality. Approximately 200 artillery pieces, 25,000 muskets, powder and ammunition in quantities sufficient to sustain an army through a campaign season, and clothing and equipment for approximately 30,000 men were shipped across the Atlantic through ports where the French government had quietly ensured that inspection regimes would not examine the manifests too closely. When Continental Army officers inventoried the Hortalez shipments, they found materiel that met the standard of what a properly equipped European army would carry into the field, not the improvised, substandard, inadequate equipment that American manufacturing capacity was capable of producing in 1777. Historians who have examined the logistics of the Saratoga campaign of that year, the engagement that shifted French policy from covert support to open military alliance, have concluded that a significant portion of the Continental Army's artillery and musket ammunition at Saratoga came from the Hortalez shipments. The battle that brought France formally into the war was fought, in material terms, with weapons that France had been providing covertly for more than a year before it declared its hand. The problem was what all of this meant in financial terms. Beaumarchais maintained, consistently and with increasing urgency as the years accumulated, that the goods he had delivered were commercial consignments, not gifts, not subsidies routed through a convenient cover, but merchandise delivered against a contractual obligation that the American Congress was bound in law and equity to honor. He had accounts. He had shipping records. He had the documentation of what Hortalez had purchased, what it had paid, what it had shipped, and what balance remained outstanding against the transaction. The American position, developed over the course of several congressional investigations beginning in 1778, and defended with variations by every subsequent administration, was that the goods had been represented to the Congress as a gift, that the French crown had chosen a commercial vehicle for reasons of diplomatic necessity, but that the underlying transaction was a subsidy from a sovereign ally, not a commercial consignment from a private merchant, and that no enforceable commercial debt to Beaumarchais or to his successors existed. The private correspondence between Beaumarchais and Vergennes that would have resolved this question, the communications establishing, in terms that were not deliberately ambiguous, exactly what kind of transaction the Hortalez operation was held in French government archives throughout the period of the dispute, and was not made available to the American parties or to the congressional committees that examined the claims. The ambiguity was not an accident. It was the product of a deliberate design by a foreign ministry that understood the value of preserving flexibility in arrangements whose ultimate terms would be determined by events that no one in 1776 could reliably predict. An arrangement readable as a gift in diplomatic contexts and as a commercial obligation in financial ones was more useful to Vergennes than a transaction with a single fixed legal character, because the French ministry's interests across all the possible outcomes of the American war were not identical. The Hortalez arrangement gave France maximum flexibility at every stage. Beaumarchais paid for that flexibility with the last 20 years of his life and with the ruin of his commercial affairs. His estate continued to pay for it for 36 years after his death. The overt Dutch lending channel operated on different terms and through a different kind of institution. Amsterdam in the 1770s was no longer a military power of any consequence in European affairs. The Dutch East India Company was in managed decline. The Dutch Republic's role in the balance of power had been contracting for decades. But the Amsterdam Exchange remained the most technically sophisticated capital market in the world. capable of pricing sovereign debt instruments in more currencies and across a wider range of counterparties than any other exchange, and capable of connecting sovereign borrowers whose creditworthiness was uncertain to investor pools whose appetite for yield was sufficient to compensate them for that uncertainty. The American Congress had agents operating in Amsterdam from the early years of the conflict, but the figure who established the first substantial Dutch loan to the United States was Jean de Neufville, an Amsterdam merchant of French Protestant extraction who combined genuine sympathy for the American cause with an equally genuine interest in the fee income and commission revenue that a successful placement of American loan instruments in the Dutch market would generate for the house that managed the transaction. De Neufville began negotiating in 1777 for a loan of approximately 1 million guilders to be distributed among Dutch investors through a bond instrument carrying interest at 5% per annum. The loan was offered before the Dutch Republic had officially recognized American independence, before a commercial treaty between the two countries had been concluded, and before the Continental Congress had established any formal mechanism for servicing foreign obligations. The instrument that de Neufville marketed to Amsterdam investors rested on the prospective commercial output of a nation still at war on its own territory, governed by an assembly whose legal standing remained contested in European diplomatic circles, and whose capacity to honor future financial obligations depended entirely on a military outcome that had not been determined. The investors who purchased those early instruments understood what they were buying. The secondary market price for American debt in Amsterdam throughout the active war years reflected the market's ongoing assessment of the probability that the United States would survive as an independent state capable of servicing its obligations. When the Saratoga victory in October of 1777 shifted the military picture, and when French recognition and alliance followed in February of 1778, those instruments appreciated. The Dutch investor, who had held American paper through the worst of the war, and who sold after Saratoga, made a return that compensated him for the risk he had borne. The Dutch investor who had sold at the bottom bore a loss that expressed his judgment, ultimately incorrect, about American prospects. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The figure who placed the Dutch lending relationship on a formally structured basis was John Adams, who arrived in the Netherlands in 1780, carrying a commission that combined the functions of diplomatic minister and debt agent. Adams was not a financier and had not operated in European capital markets before his appointment. He had no established relationships in the Amsterdam commercial community and no treaty authority to offer prospective lenders. What he had was a quality that the Dutch merchant class found persuasive precisely because it was uncommon among sovereign borrowers seeking access to the Amsterdam market: a willingness to state plainly, in terms that experienced creditors could evaluate and price, what the United States would and would not promise. Adams refused to authorize interest rates that would compound to levels beyond the revenue capacity of a post-war federal government. He was explicit about the risks that Dutch investors were assuming and about the timeline on which repayment could realistically be expected. He described the commercial and agricultural potential of the North American continent with the specificity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the account books of New England merchants and who understood the difference between what a land could produce and what a government could reliably collect from that production in the form of revenue. By June of 1782, Adams had negotiated the first formal loan concluded by an American diplomatic representative with foreign private lenders, 5 million guilders, drawn from a consortium of Dutch banking houses organized around the Amsterdam firms of Willink, Van Stafhorst, and Hubbard. The loan carried interest at 5% per annum and was structured with repayment terms that the Treasury of the new Republic spent the better part of 2 decades meeting, imperfectly and at the cost of domestic expenditures that had to be deferred in order to keep the foreign debt current. The firms of Willink and Van Stapphorst became the American government's primary fiscal agents in Europe for the first several decades of the Republic's existence, managing debt service payments, handling currency conversions, and providing the continuous commercial banking function that the new government required in European markets but could not perform through its own institutions. The final payment on the principal obligations created by the original 1782 loan and its subsequent tranches, extended through 1784, 1787, and 1788, was made in 1809, 26 years after the Treaty of Paris formally ended the conflict the loans had helped finance. The creditors of the American Revolution were patient. They were patient because the terms had been structured to allow for patience, and because the interest was accumulating while they waited. The French government's formal lending program, conducted through Benjamin Franklin's mission in Paris and separate from both the Hortalez operation and the unofficial subsidies that Vergennes' correspondence shows were also being considered, totaled approximately 6 million livres across multiple tranches, authorized between 1777 and 1782. The terms were deliberately generous by the standards of the period. Interest rates were set below what the Amsterdam market would have required for a comparable credit risk. Repayment schedules were extended beyond what commercial lenders would have accepted. The timing of initial payment obligations was managed in ways that allowed the Congress to draw on the funds without immediately triggering interest charges it could not service. The French government's financial support for the American cause was real, and the generosity in its terms was real. It was also a strategic investment, with a cost that French finance ministers of the 1780s were beginning to calculate in terms that their predecessors had not anticipated. The total French expenditure on the American intervention, across loans, direct subsidies, naval operations, and the costs of maintaining the military alliance that the Saratoga campaign had made possible, reached levels that contributed materially to the fiscal crisis that engulfed Bourbon governance in the late 1780s. The political consequences of that fiscal crisis, the convocation of the Estates General in 1789, the failure of reform, the collapse of royal authority, are the subject of a separate historical record. The financial thread connecting French lending to the American Revolution to the financial circumstances that preceded the French Revolution is not hidden. It was visible to contemporaries, argued in the memorials of French finance ministers who warned that the cost of American intervention was unsustainable within the existing structure of Bourbon fiscal governance. What the standard narrative of either revolution tends to omit is the ledger entry connecting them, a capital transfer from a European monarchy that weakened the Republic's primary adversary and contributed to the conditions that destroyed the monarchy itself. The Beaumarchais claims dispute extended across 6 decades and left a documentary record that is, in its accumulated detail, one of the most revealing archives of the gap between what the financial record of the American Revolution shows and what the official account was designed to contain. Beaumarchais filed his first formal claim against the United States in 1781, while the war was still in progress. His argument was consistent from the first filing to the last. The goods he had delivered through Hortalez at Compagnie were commercial consignments for which a commercial debt existed, and that debt carried interest from the date of delivery at rates established in the Hortalez account books. By the time of his death in 1799, the principal claim had grown, with accumulated interest, to a sum that the American Treasury regarded as implausible, and that Beaumarchais' estate regarded as precisely correct. His daughter pursued the claim through the Napoleonic period, through the Restoration, and into the July Monarchy. The settlement of 1835, approximately 800,000 francs against a claimed amount several times larger, was not a legal adjudication. No court with jurisdiction over the question had ruled on its merits. It was a diplomatic resolution, authorized by the American Congress, in the context of broader negotiations over mutual claims arising from the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, and it reflected the Congress's interest in closing a long-outstanding account rather than any determination about who had been right about the terms of the original transaction. The private correspondence between Beaumarchais and Vergennes, the communications that would have established, in terms not designed for later deniability, what the Hortalez arrangement had actually been, was not produced during any of the congressional investigations, not made available during the diplomatic negotiations that preceded the 1835 settlement, and has been subject to scholarly examination only in the 2 centuries since the dispute was closed. What that correspondence shows, read alongside the Hortalez account books and the subsequent claims documentation, is that the original transaction was structured by Vergennes with a deliberate ambiguity that served French strategic interests across multiple possible outcomes. The French ministry was not confused about what it was authorizing. It authorized an arrangement whose terms could shift with circumstances, and Beaumarchais was the instrument through which that ambiguity was maintained in operational form. The cost of maintaining that ambiguity was borne, over 6 decades, by the man who had been selected to manage it and by his successors. The debt that Alexander Hamilton consolidated in his report to Congress in 1790 included, in its foreign component, the French and Dutch obligations that the revolutionary finance experience had created. Hamilton's argument for assumption and consolidation, that the United States could not function as a creditworthy sovereign power in international capital markets if its obligations to foreign lenders remained in a state of contested arrears, was not a theoretical position about the desirability of sound public finance. It was a practical assessment of what the previous 15 years had demonstrated about the relationship between sovereign creditworthiness and military capability. The Republic had been financed on credit terms that required institutional mechanisms capable of servicing those terms reliably over time. The Constitution of 1787, which granted the federal government explicit taxing power and prohibited state interference with obligations contracted by the federal authority, was in material part a response to this requirement. The national bank that Hamilton proposed in 1790, modeled on the Bank of England, designed to manage federal deposits and maintain a uniform national currency, was built to make the United States the kind of borrower that the Willink and Van Staphorst Consortium would continue to extend credit to, on terms that did not require a Saratoga-level military event to justify the risk premium. The entire financial architecture of the early republic traces, in its structural logic, back to the terms on which the revolution was financed, to what the Dutch investors had demanded, to what the French crown had offered and later claimed to have offered as something different, and to the gap between what was promised in 1777 and 1778 and what was delivered, with interest, over the following 3 decades. What the historical account rarely holds beside Hamilton's consolidation plan is the full weight of what that plan was designed to absorb. The foreign debt component alone, French crown loans, Dutch bond tranches, the accumulated arrears on obligations that the Congress under the Articles of Confederation had serviced so erratically that Amsterdam creditors had twice suspended further advances, pending evidence that the existing debt would be honored, totaled approximately $10 million at the time Hamilton submitted his report. That figure represented a significant share of the new federal government's total annual revenue capacity. Servicing it required not merely political will but an institutional structure capable of collecting revenue from a population spread across 13 states that had spent a decade resisting exactly the kind of federal taxing authority the debt service now required. The whiskey tax that Hamilton proposed as part of his revenue program, and that produced the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, the first armed challenge to federal authority under the new Constitution, was in direct and traceable terms a consequence of the financial obligations the Revolution had created. The men who took up arms against the federal tax collector in western Pennsylvania in 1794 were, without knowing it, the final debtors in a chain of obligation that ran back to the account books of a fictitious Paris trading company and the decisions of a French foreign minister who had never intended the terms he authorized to be clearly understood. There is a figure in the Hamilton Consolidation Program whose role the standard account tends to minimize: Robert Morris, the Philadelphia merchant who had served as superintendent of finance for the Continental Congress from 1781 to 1784, and who had spent those 3 years attempting to impose some degree of fiscal coherence on a government that possessed almost none. Morris had operated in the revolutionary financial landscape at the level where theory and practicality collided most directly. He understood what the Hortalez goods had cost, what the Dutch bond instruments required in servicing, and what the gap between the Congress's stated obligations and its actual capacity to meet them had done to American credit standing in every European capital where it had tried to borrow. His efforts to create a national bank as early as 1781, the Bank of North America, chartered by the Congress and by the state of Pennsylvania, anticipated Hamilton's program by nearly a decade and rested on the same diagnosis: that foreign creditors would not continue to extend capital to an entity that had no institutional mechanism for debt service, and that without continued access to foreign capital, the war itself was at risk of simply running out of money before it could be decided militarily. The Bank of North America did not survive into the constitutional era in the form Morris had designed. Its federal charter was contested, its state charter was modified, and its function as a quasi-central institution was never fully realized. But its existence demonstrated that the argument Hamilton would make in 1790 was not a theoretical proposal arriving without precedent. It was a second attempt to build an institution whose necessity the revolutionary financing experience had already established beyond serious doubt. The long consequence of the revolutionary financing structure did not exhaust itself in Hamilton's consolidation. It ran through the debates over the First Bank of the United States, which Jefferson opposed and Hamilton championed, and whose capitalization and operational design reflected the requirements that Amsterdam creditors had established as the minimum condition for continued confidence in American sovereign debt. It ran through the War of 1812, when the absence of a functioning national bank, the first bank's charter having been allowed to expire in 1811 over objections nearly identical to those Jefferson had raised in 1791, left the Treasury unable to coordinate emergency borrowing and forced the federal government to issue obligations at terms far less favorable than a functioning banking institution would have been able to negotiate. The pattern that the revolutionary financing had established, borrow under conditions of institutional weakness, pay back at institutional cost, repeated itself with sufficient regularity across the first half of the 19th century that the repetition itself became a structural feature of American fiscal governance rather than a series of accidents. The creditors of the Amsterdam Exchange had understood in 1777 what it would take American legislators another century to accept fully, that a sovereign borrower without a credible institutional mechanism for debt service is not a sovereign borrower. It is a credit risk priced accordingly, and the terms extracted from it reflect that pricing with precision. The admission that most directly connects the revolutionary financing architecture to its long-term consequences came not from a statesman or a diplomat, but from a creditor. The firm of Hope and Company of Amsterdam, which had become one of the principal agents for American debt in the European market during the 1780s and 90s, maintained internal correspondence through the period of the early Republic that was deposited with the Amsterdam City Archives in the 19th century and has been examined by financial historians working on the origins of American sovereign credit. The Hope correspondence from 1788 and 1789, the period bridging the ratification of the Constitution and the beginning of Hamilton's tenure at Treasury, shows that the Amsterdam creditor community regarded the new constitutional framework primarily as a mechanism for debt service. The clauses granting the federal government taxing authority and prohibiting state interference with federal obligations were read in Amsterdam not as political philosophy, but as contract terms, as the specific provisions that determined whether the United States was now a creditor-worthy borrower or remained the same uncertain credit risk it had been throughout the war. When Hamilton's first report on public credit arrived in Amsterdam in translation in 1790, the response among the houses that had been holding American paper was not surprise at his proposals. It was relief that the proposals matched, with sufficient precision, what the creditor community had concluded was the minimum institutional requirement for continued engagement with American sovereign debt. The loan was never a simple transaction, and the account was never cleanly balanced. It was an arrangement made under conditions of maximum uncertainty by parties whose interests overlapped in some respects and diverged in others, documented in instruments designed to preserve flexibility for the parties with the most leverage, and formalized only to the degree that the party with the least leverage required formalization in order to accept what was being offered. The Continental Congress needed capital and was in no position to negotiate from strength. The French crown needed deniability and was positioned to provide capital on terms that preserved it. The Dutch investors needed yield sufficient to compensate them for the risk of lending to a government that did not yet legally exist. Each party received what it needed most immediately. The question of what each party was owed in return was left, with full awareness and deliberate design, to be determined by future events that none of the original parties could control, and some of them did not survive to see resolved. What the standard account calls the founding financial settlement was, in the record that survives outside the official narrative, an extended and imperfectly resolved series of claims, counterclaims, institutional adaptations, and political evasions that shaped American governance for the better part of a century. The republic that emerged was not the republic that the financing had been designed to produce. It was the republic that the financing made necessary, built to the specifications of its creditors as much as to the ideals of its founders, and carrying the terms of its original obligations in every institutional arrangement it constructed to meet them. The resolution took decades. It produced settlements that satisfied no party fully. It left in the historical record a documented gap between the official account of French generosity and the financial account of French strategic investment, a gap visible in the Beaumarchais correspondence, audible in the annual reports of French finance ministers describing an unsustainable fiscal burden, and traceable through the institutional architecture of the American Republic, built partly to service obligations that the standard narrative of the founding era rarely places at the center of the story. The money moved in 1776. The republic it helped create is still operating today. The ledger entry that made both of those things possible was constructed to resist final accounting. It has, in almost every material respect, succeeded in doing exactly that. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.